he becomes a very close friend of the Quaker feminist abolitionist Amy Post. And it's to Amy Post that Harriet finally tells her story. And a few years later, Amy convinces Harriet to write her story as a contribution to the movement.
America would have ignored the contradiction of a freedom-loving nation tolerating slavery if they could have. But what free blacks, what slaves, what they did in conjunction with white allies who were committed to anti-slavery was to make it increasingly difficult for the nation to ignore this great glaring contradiction.
The anti-slavery message struck a nerve among many Northerners as a massive influx of immigrants began putting new strains on their society.
The Irish wage laborers who built those railroads, who dug the canals, were the first real wage labor working class in America. And the growth of that working class is going to become a major social development of 19th century America.
But there was this notion that slave labor and free labor could not exist side by side, that slave labor would drive out, would devalue free labor.
With victory in the Mexican War bringing vast new territories into the Union, the conflict between slave states and free states would explode. The South wanted room to grow. The North saw a promised land for free labor. As violent confrontation loomed in the West, Congress devised the Compromise of 1850. California would be admitted as a free state, and in return, the South would get the most severe fugitive slave law in the nation's history.
The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, you have to understand what this law said. It said that a person could be accused of being a fugitive slave and that person would have no right of self-defense, no right to speak on his or her own behalf, no right to a lawyer, no right to a jury trial. Think about it.
The law was a resounding defeat for abolitionists. Local officials would receive the hefty sum of $10 for every African American handed over to slave catchers. It is the beginning of a reign of terror to the colored population, Harriet declared. As danger mounted, scores of Harriet's friends and neighbors fled to Canada.
Many a wife discovered a secret she had never known before, that her husband was a fugitive and must leave her to ensure his own safety. Worse still, many a husband discovered that his wife had fled from slavery years ago, and as the child follows the condition of the mother, the children of his love were liable to be seized and carried into slavery.
As the Cotton Kingdom reached new heights of wealth and power, Lewis Hughes married Matilda, a cook on the McGee plantation. Soon after, she gave birth to twins. But motherhood did not spare Matilda from overwork. Mrs. McGee's demands were unrelenting, forcing Matilda to neglect her babies.
My heart was sore and heavy, for my wife was almost run to death with work. My blood boiled in my veins to see my wife so abused. Yet I dare not open my mouth.
Within 6 months, the twins were dead.
Well, it's a heartbreaking situation, and what makes it even worse is that you realize that every slaveholding household in the nation had this kind of a scene sooner or later. We have babies dying like crazy. We call it infant mortality. That's a very clinical word for babies dying.
For the young couple, there seemed no end to suffering. Nearly 250 years after Africans were first landed on America's shores, the Supreme Court of the United States would proclaim that blacks, by virtue of their race, were not persons before the law. In 1857, in a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that Congress had no authority to limit the spread of slavery to any territory. The Chief Justice's words stunned African Americans.
Roger B. Tawney, a Southerner, reads a decision that says that Dred Scott, as a black person, and black people generally, had never been, were not then, could never be citizens of the United States, and as such have no rights which white men are bound to respect.
Northerners were furious. Wherever our flag floats, protested one newspaper editor, it is the flag of slavery. When abolitionists sought ways to circumvent the Dred Scott ruling, slaveholders pressed for a federal slave law.
This is astounding. By the late 1850s, the Southerners are demanding that the federal government pass a slave code for all the territories that it acquired in the West. And obviously, Northerners aren't about to accept this kind of thing.
The battle over slavery was crippling the political process. On a bright spring morning, Congressman Preston Brooks from South Carolina entered the Senate chamber and beat Senator Charles Sumner, the fiery abolitionist, into unconsciousness.
Violence is erupting in the halls of government, on the streets of Washington, involving our lawmakers. There are people who are coming to sessions of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate armed. In fact, one letter says the only people who aren't coming with two guns are those who are coming with two guns and a knife.
In the midst of the partisan turmoil, all eyes turned to the 1860 presidential election and the Republican nominee, the Free Soil candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Both Edward McGee and Lewis Hughes anxiously awaited the results.
Boss had been reading the papers when he broke out with the exclamation, "The very idea of electing an old rail splitter to the presidency of the United States. Well, he'll never take his seat."
The Democratic Party had fractured North and South, giving victory to the rail splitter from Illinois. The first time a candidate was elected without carrying a single Southern state.
Remember, Lincoln was elected committed to not interfering with slavery anywhere. He was only committed to restricting its expansion. But at that point, the slaveholders had become so convinced that the North was taken over by these lunatic abolitionists that that is the way they viewed Abraham Lincoln's election, no matter what Lincoln said.
Even before Lincoln took office, 7 Southern states withdrew from the Union. Enslaved people across the South were heartened by the news. For Louis and Matilda, the moment held the first ray of hope for freedom.
Three, discuss how the emotional and psychological makeup of both the North and the South were turned into political hysteria by the press as the key issue of slavery was debated during the numerous sectional conflicts. Also discuss one of the sectional conflicts that developed over the key issue, being slavery, and how it helped lead to the end of a national two-party system. So, the the press played a major role in bringing about the Civil War. It exploited sectional stories, creating stereotyped views for both the North and the South. These were unrealistic and very damaging to the political process, since they made it impossible for either side to settle their differences. This can be best exemplified by Uncle Tom's Cabin and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia. So first, the most celebrated publication during the period was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in an anti-slavery magazine over a 10-month period between 1851 and 1852. Later that same year, it was published in book form due to popular demand. Its net effect was to inflame one half of the nation against the other. It helped produce disunion and civil war by giving people an image of slavery which was not universally correct, but implied it was. The book did so by using the emotions of different heartbreaking episodes of slavery. The fact that Mrs. Stowe had never personally observed slavery did not harm the sale of the novel. The importance of Uncle Tom's Cabin lay not in whether it was an accurate account of the institution of slavery. Rather, the novel was important because it supplied Northerners with concrete stereotypes. In October 1859, John Brown's attempt to incite a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry of Virginia was portrayed by Southern newspapers as an intolerable Northern attack on Southern property and lives. The raid became even more reprehensible when Southerners learned that Brown had been financed by Northern abolitionists, businessmen, and politicians. Southern newspapers blamed the Republican Party for the outrage, even though conservative Republicans condemned Brown's harebrained scheme as harebrained. This fiasco, which should have been looked upon as an isolated local disturbance and the act of a misguided man, was important in destroying the last bonds of sentiment holding the Union together as Southern emotions reached a new high. The end result of these false stereotypes, which each side developed of the other, was hostility in the forms of intense sectional conflicts. This led to the major means of communication between the North and the South, a nationally integrated two-party system being destroyed. This left the sections with no way of communicating with each other in order to settle their differences. The most significant sectional conflicts that tore at the emotional and psychological fiber of the country are as follows. The first conflict entered around the Wilmot Proviso, which was introduced in August of 1846 by a representative from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot. Soon after the Mexican-American War began, President James K. Polk requested $2 million from Congress with which to negotiate a peace and the purchase of territory from Mexico that he assumed would follow the war. When the appropriation bill got to the House of Representatives, it was amended by Wilmot using words taken verbatim from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The proviso stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the territories that might be acquired from Mexico. Although the proviso was never passed, the debate over it aroused the country. Sectional animosity was heightened as state legislatures and other public bodies debated the principle incorporated in the proviso. It should be noted that at the time, most Northerners were still perfectly content to let slavery and hence the blacks remain unmolested in the states where it already existed. The next major sectional conflict was the Compromise of 1850. By 1849, the the politics of avoidance was no longer possible when nearly 80,000 49ers flocked to California after discovering gold at Sutter's Mill. The California gold rush forced President Taylor to deal with the territorial issue as California needed some kind of civil organization. Consequently, he advocated a straightforward plan to skip the territorial stage and have the people of the territories, one from Mexico, adopt constitutions and apply directly for statehood. Southern leaders were shocked. If the anti-slavery forces were permitted to keep slavery out of California and New Mexico, how could it be stopped from keeping it out of all future territories? If California and New Mexico came into the Union as free states, power might shift so decisively to the North that slavery in the South itself might be endangered. All over the South, alarmed Southerners held rallies denouncing the attack on their institutions and rights. The vehemence of the Southern response alarmed Unionists everywhere, Northerners, one of which was the aging Senator Henry Clay. Consequently, Clay offered to the Senate a series of resolutions that he hoped all sides could agree on. From these resolutions eventually came the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 is a collective term of later origin applied to the 5 laws enacted from September 9th to September 20th. So it wasn't proposed as the Compromise of 1850. It was a name that was later attributed to the following. The resolutions involved admitting California as a free state on the grounds that it wanted to be admitted to the Union as a free state. 2. Organizing New Mexico as a territory without restrictions on slavery and adjusting the Texas-New Mexico boundary. Organizing the territorial government of Utah with identical provisions. Passing a strict new fugitive slave law, which the South had desired, and barring the slave trade from Washington, D.C., but not slavery itself. The net effect of the compromise was that it prevented the threatened secession of the South until war finally broke out in April of 1861. So that's incredibly significant about the Compromise of 1850. It stalled the Civil War by 11 years. Another important effect of the compromise was that it hastened the breakup of the Whig Party, as we looked at earlier. Northern and Southern Whigs were so alienated from each other that they were unable to stand together in the election of 1852. For the nation, the decay of this major party was a sign of things to come. Since its beginning, the Whig Party had been an organization within which spokesmen of some of the most influential business interests of the North had been able to sit down with the richest planters of the border states and the Deep South and discuss, in a spirit of moderation, the major problems of politics. Now, this major link between the sections was being destroyed with the breakup of the Whig Party, with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The Whig Party disappeared and the Republican Party came into being. This issue of extension of slavery into the territories was reopened in January of 1854 with the introduction by Senator Stephen A. Douglas of a bill for organizing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. The measure incorporated the principle of popular sovereignty. So take note of that. That's incredibly important. This concept said residents of each state or territory should be allowed to vote for or against slavery. This measure also permitted the admission of the territories with or without slavery. The bill essentially repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and thus formally established the doctrine of congressional non-intervention into the territories. Passed after 3 months of bitter debate, the bill ended up antagonizing both parties. Republicans were vehement because they felt the act was a plot by slaveholders to spread slavery into all territories of the Union. And Democrats saw no reason to put slavery to vote over and over again. Another major conflict came as a result of the Dred Scott decision in 1857. The basic judgment was that Scott, because he was a slave, was neither a citizen of Missouri nor a citizen of the United States, and had no constitutional rights to sue in the federal courts. The decision also established that black slaves were a species of property protected by the Constitution, and hence Congress had no authority to abolish slavery in the territories, and the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Finally, the decision held that Scott's temporary residence in free territory had not made him free upon his return to Missouri, since his status was determined by the laws of the state in which he resided when the question of his freedom was raised. In reaching this decision, the court discussed several highly controversial slavery issues about which sectional hostility had long been aroused. Rather than settle these issues, the decision accelerated the polarization which resulted in the Civil War. The final crisis, which the results of the election of 1860 led to the dismantling of the Union and John Brown's raid. Brown considered himself God's instrument for destroying slavery. In October 1859, he led his band of 18 men, including 2 of his sons and 5 blacks, in an assault on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown captured the armory easily, but there was no slave uprising. Only a few slaves lived in the area, and none of them had been told of the raid. State and federal troops quickly forced Brown to retreat to an engine house near the arsenal. The next day, the U.S. Marine Command, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, stormed the engine house, killing 10 of Brown's men and capturing Brown and most of the others. Brown was quickly tried by a Virginia court, condemned for treason, and executed on December 2nd, 1859. However, his eloquent defense during the trial convinced many Northerners that the abolition of slavery was a noble cause that required drastic, possible violent action. At his sentencing, Brown received one of the classic American speeches. Quote, "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done." From the moment of his capture to his execution, Brown conducted himself with a fortitude and dignity that commanded the respect of the judges and his captors. To all questions regarding his motives, he had only one answer. He had desired to free the slaves. He believed himself an instrument in the hands of God to this end. Thus, Brown became something of a martyr, and his actions and death inspired the words to a marching song that was the unofficial anthem of the Union troops. John Brown's body lies moldering in a grave. Brown's raid had a powerful effect on Southerners, as Uncle Tom's Cabin had on Northerners. The novel had seemed to expose the awful realities of slavery. The raid seemed to expose the terrifying reality of the Northern threat to the South and its peculiar institution, as it had been called. Thus, to many Southerners, the crimes of John Brown were simply the practical illustrations of the doctrine of publicity received at his trial and subsequent hanging. Brown became a noble martyr in a great cause. And for concept, we'll get to concept 4 will be the election of 1860, so we'll talk about that later.